600 years before the Common Era. Mr. Tuttle comes to us from a father who fought in World War II at Iwo Jima and carried the famous flag from the landing craft partway up the mountain. The flag at the summit of Iwo Jima became a victory symbol for the fighters there and for the American soldiers and supporters around the world until their victory. Boyd is president of Digital Legend Publishing Company that has promoted the Heartland theory of Rod Meldrum and Jonathan Neville, two of our previous speakers. His interest in the Book of Mormon can be seen in the Digital Legend motto, which is to uplift and inspire. That, I believe, is a commonality of our forum participants, for we have all found some uplift and inspiration in the Book of Mormon. Examples might include Alma's exercising of faith by planting the seed, Jacob's point that men are that they might have joy, and of course the inspiring visit by the Christ to the people of the land bountiful. Boyd Tuttle, like our speaker last week, George Potter, who presented South America as the likely site of Book of Mormon geography, advocates a minority view. His publication of the Universal Model of Science clearly illustrates this point. His courage to take a minority stand and advocate for it will open new vistas for our participants, and I encourage you all to give him your attention, respect, and best questions. Let us pray. Awesome creator of the great and small, all things in and beyond our view, we bow in gratitude to unite our thinking, for we all worship you. For we recognize the world you created provides a marvelous womb for us, yet how you created, when and why remain issues for us to discuss. This evening, we focus our attention on the story of the Mulekites, how they traveled, where they landed, what are their possible residential sites. And we thank you for our guest presenter, Boyd Tuttle, who comes prepared to offer explanation of how the Mulekites traveled and how they fared. Bless him with patience with us, Lord, we pray, that we will understand with clarity the words he has to say. And may we gain understanding of creation's mystery as we embrace this fascinating segment of Book of Mormon history. We are diverse in our backgrounds, facing pandemics of COVID, racism, poverty, and grief. Yet we come together in this new year in the hope your Spirit will lead us to relief. And we pray for one another, despite religious and cultural differences, and ask your blessing on all our participants to have open minds, teachable senses. Guide us with your Spirit. Let us feel its gentle nudge. Let all our senses be awakened, and let us defer the inclination to judge. And as we give consideration to Brother Boyd's research, his perspective, his points of view, we ask that your Spirit guide us to recognize what is true. Amen.
Boyd, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction. That was really a really good introduction, Paul. And I really appreciated you mentioning that about my father. He was my hero, no question. I'm the youngest of 7 and only had 25 years with him. And then he passed on at the young age of 67. And so he's taught me a lot and given me a lot of motivation to do some of the things I've done in life. So Grateful to him and his memory. So thank you for that. You did mention that I do have a day job, which is publishing books. That wasn't always my job. I started out after I got a degree in engineering and mechanical and design engineering at BYU, and got hired by Xerox Corporation in Rochester, New York, and moved there in 1986. And I actually spent 27 years with them. 5 of those years were in Japan, which is where I served my mission, and really enjoyed that experience. I loved that those people and that culture. And coming back from that, it kind of launched me in a new direction. So I spent a few more years with Xerox, but then ended up just feeling like I had done, I had kind of reached an end point there. Although it was a great career, a great company, but I sought an early retirement and got it, and had 18 months to kind of reinvent myself and figure out what to do for another career, because I was still in my 40s. And I landed on this idea of publishing. At first, it was just printing and using some breakthrough print-on-demand technology that Xerox had developed and so forth. And that got me down to into this space of publishing books. And in time, I kind of learned the ropes. And 10 years later, I'm still in business, which is kind of a rare thing for most new startups. And we have had some runs with some particularly great authors who have come along, and I think one of them is joining us in the conference today, as a matter of fact. In fact, one of them is going to be a presenter, and one of them has presented. A couple of them have presented. Rod presented. I think you mentioned that. Jonathan Neville. David Reed is his latest book, and I think he's on the schedule. So these guys have really been I'll say mentors in this space of kind of new education, new learning. I like the way you said it, Paul, was it a minority position? And I actually quite like that. I never like being in the majority. It's just something about my upbringing. I like being the underdog. I like having a minority position on almost any topic. And I seem to find myself in that space a lot, but I think all of us in this room probably fit that category in one degree or another. So, welcome to the crowd, right? But anyway, I just want to launch into this. So I did an expedition last year, and it was quite enlightening to me in a lot of ways. And so I want to go walk through that with you. And I want to keep it very open. Anytime during the presentation, don't hesitate to wave or say, hey, I got a question or something like that, because so many times when you ask the question, everybody else wants to know that same answer anyway. So it'll help to move things along. There's also a chat function on these. You can send a chat message, I think, if it'll reach me. You can ask questions that way too. And maybe who's ever hosting it can make sure I don't miss those. All right, so let's see if I'm where I think I want to be here. I was going to introduce you to a couple of new titles that I have coming, but I'm going to skip that right now and just start here. So let me share this screen. Let's see, we're screen sharing. There it is, screen share. Boom, boom, boom. PowerPoint slideshow. I think this is it. Now, are you seeing a full screen there? Is this slide intentionally blank? Are you seeing all that?
Yes, we have that.
Okay, great. So that's kind of where I want to start. So I've titled this discussion "In the Footsteps of Mulek," which is the name of a forthcoming book. It's about not just about the Phonecia expedition, but about the whole concept of Mulek and his entourage, and they're making their way to the Promised Land. And I actually am working with a co-author on that, David Doan, who I'll introduce later in the discussion. And you can get my information off of this screen if you want to contact me or call me or anything. I'm certainly open to that. I just was going to talk a little bit about who or what's a Mulekite, and then my experience. And it's kind of all jumbled together, honestly. I can't say this is the most logically thought through outline for a presentation, but we'll plunge in. So April of 2019, I saw a presentation by Philip Beale. I got to know Philip in this, and Philip wrote a book called Sailing Close to the Wind about his expedition that he did in this same ship in 2008. And I was really intrigued by his work, and in getting to know him, actually invited him to lunch, and we had a nice visit. Anyway, bottom line is he ended up inviting me to join him on this next expedition, which was then featured in this article in LDS Living in September 19. This article came out, and I've kind of inserted pictures there that obviously are not contiguous with the article because this was actually from the voyage. But the article, I just wanted to outline it because it kind of outlines everything I'll be talking about. And it basically just, I captured a few of the lines from the article, and they said, this guy hopes to retrace the path of Mulek based on his belief that Mulek traveled west aboard a Phoenician sailing vessel. So I'm like, hey, there's this Phoenician ship. Let's see if it can really do this. And Tuttle surmises that he escaped detection as with the child king safely in her womb, as possibly the unborn child of King Zedekiah. And then there's a book coming and so forth. The goes on to say British explorer and former Royal British Navy mariner Philip Beale leads the expedition. Got to know Philip really great. He's the guy I was just talking about. And he set out to prove his theory that the ancient Phoenicians arrived in Americas once or many times before the Europeans. And that was his thesis. And he said, yeah, I welcome Tuttle on board. It's no pleasure cruise. And I'm here to tell you that is a true statement. So the article goes on to say that Mulek's party escaped the Babylonian siege, but it doesn't say that they built a ship, right? That's distinctly missing. You know, it's clearly a distinct from the other stories of Lehi and the Jaredites, who, you know, did build ships. And so from that, I have concluded that they had to sail on a ship that was already built. And there was only one party who was building and sailing in the open sea, and that was the Phoenicians in 600 BC. So we learned that from the Book of Mormon. Also, and this is in the article, that they discovered these people and they turn out in the Book of Mormon. One little observation that I've made, and I'd love to go into this in detail, but we just won't have time, but that is the whole concept of the textual analysis, Phoenician words showing up in the text of the Book of Mormon, which they do. And the most obvious one is obviously Sidon, which was the capital city of the Phoenician Empire when it began. I said this and they quoted me on it. I said, it's one thing to sit in a cushy chair and pontificate about what might have been. It's a whole different thing to don the gear of the ancients and actually go where they went in a vessel identical to one that plied these waters, 2,600 years ago. And so for me, that was kind of the marching order. I want to go and do, not just sit and read other people's contemplations. I really got motivation too from this statement by Elder Holland, which he gave in 2017. And he said that our testimonies aren't dependent on evidence, but not to seek for and not to acknowledge intellectual documentable support for our belief when it is available is to needlessly limit an otherwise incomparably strong theological position and denies a unique persuasive vocabulary in the latter-day arena of religious investigation and sectarian debate. And so here it is. I mean, this is right there in front of me. So I think this kind of an expedition is the kind of intellectual documentable support for our belief that he was talking about. And so, that was my motivation. Also, it's interesting to kind of look back. I remember I was just a kid. I was 12 years old when Thor Heyerdahl appeared on the scene. And most of you will remember those days. It was amazingly well documented. I mean, it shows up on the front of National Geographic worldwide, hailing the remarkable expeditionary exploits of Thor Heyerdahl. So I have to say, from a PR point of view, this guy was brilliant. I mean, he was a genius to be able to get this kind of coverage for a two expeditions that honestly, look at, this is how the ships ended up. One sunk and the other one barely made it. But yet it was hailed as a great accomplishment, which it was. It was clearly, I mean, I don't fault him. It was pretty amazing that he had the courage to do it, frankly. But I also thought it was interesting that the church, that is, you know, the LDS Church's New Era, at the time made quite a big deal about this. And in the New Era, you know, they said, our deliberate search to acquaint Latter-day Saint youth with those who are making significant contributions. We arranged an interview, and then it goes on, and the whole article's in there. And I remember reading that article. And I was super, you know, intrigued by all of this. But at the end of the day, why don't we ever talk about this? I mean, it's kind of like, no one knows this and no one ever discusses it. And the reason is because look what happened. I mean, the ships came over, and, you know, one of them sunk and the other one barely made it. So for a long time, critics of the Book of Mormon have claimed that there is no historical evidence, right? Including there's no evidence for transoceanic sailing among the ancients. And in the 1970s, you know, the Mormons enthusiastically hailed him as exciting evidence of transatlantic crossing. However, today, no serious historian considers the raw expeditions to be representative of any ancient New World migrations. I mean, these reed boats were made out of papyrus reeds, and there's no indication that they were actually ever used on ocean-going vessels. They were probably used in the Nile River, but they were not meant for a long-term exposure to water because they become waterlogged fairly quickly. And besides, the Book of Mormon talks about hewn timbers, right? I mean, and iron tools, you know, to build them. So clearly not a good correlation, and there's no indication that these kind of ships were ever even sailing. So that's the deal. So what makes this Phoenician trip so much more important and more valuable, I think, is a lesson from, you know, building on the 1970 Thor Heyerdahl experience, which taught us that was not likely the way it works. So it wasn't failed in that sense, but it was certainly not what you would call a proof of anything. But the reason that we could even do this is because of what you're looking at here. And this is an ancient, well, this is actually not even the actual picture, but I had to find one that was as close as I could, okay? Because the actual ship that was found, the Jules Verne 7 in 1993, was found off the coast of Marseille, France. And it was found while they were digging foundations for a building. Okay, so this wasn't like deep in the water somewhere, which is what you typically would think. They were doing construction, and they came across planks and boards and stuff that were buried quite deep but they were amazingly well preserved. And when they brought in the archaeologists to look at it, they were able to actually date this thing to a Phoenician era sailing vessel around the 6th century BC. And it was amazingly intact, well preserved, every part of it, enough that a replica could be built from it. And so that is exactly what enabled Philip Beale, who I'll talk about a little as we go along, to reconstruct this ship from the leftover remains of this ship that had been sunk there off. And at the time, that was coastal waters, and now it had all been backfilled in and you know, became part of the land. But sure enough, underneath all that was this well-preserved sunken Phoenician vessel. And you can see in this image, this was the reconstruction project as it was going on. You can see the keel in the middle. You can see these the base ribs that go underneath the hull ribs, and the walls assembly coming up. This plank on the right side that you see, all these little dowels that are coming out are actually part of what is called the mortise and tenon joint technology that was developed and perfected by the Phoenicians. And Here's Captain Bill teaching about it when we were actually en route. One of the stopovers that we did, we stopped and had university students coming on board, and he was there. He had some samples of these planks, and it's quite remarkable. So the wood, he had this ship built. A lot of people say, well, wait a minute, how did he build the ship? He actually had to find shipbuilders that were still building in the traditional ways, which amazingly they still are, in an island called Arwad off the coast of Lebanon, off the coast of Syria. And it was a family, and they were the shipbuilders. And so he was able to bring these plans to them, and they were able to use that very detailed design to reconstruct the ship using that same technology. And a lot of that technology was still being employed even in their shipbuilding, which is pretty amazing. But you'll notice the main wood planks was constructed from, of course, Lebanese cedar. Okay, that's the very thing that the Phoenicians were famous for. That's what King Solomon acquired from the king. Help me out here. What was his name? Oh man, who helped build the temple? Hiram. King Hiram, I think at the time, was the one that actually came in, and they were experts. The Phoenicians were expert builders, and they had all the precious materials and so forth that were used in the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple. And so the wood here you see is Lebanese cedar for the main planks, and also the mast and the keel and all of the super strong members that were made out of that, because it's a very strong cedar wood. Also, you'll see another kind of wood. This is walnut. These dados that were dado joints. Let's see, I didn't want to go forward quite yet. These dado joints, and then you'll see these little dowels. Those dowels are actually made out of olive wood. Now, the kinds of woods were very significant because they expand and contract differently, right, depending on the species of wood. And it turns out that the olive wood expands so that it becomes so strong that there's no way you can ever get those dowels out. Once they become water soaked, they'll never be removed. Any of these things, the wood expands in such a way that it literally creates a seal that is amazingly seaworthy and waterproof. And I was a witness to that as we were on the ship for months. All right. So one of the things that's come up, I know there's been some who have been critics in the sense that said, well, the Phoenicians didn't know how to steer the ships or didn't have the technology for building these rudders. And the rudder design on this particular ship turns out to be one of the absolute key elements. So I have critical rudder technology. I mean, and it was actually, this was the part that was not left behind, okay, in the salvaged vessel, the Jules Verne 7 that was found off the coast of France. They didn't have the rudders. They weren't there. They had corroded or gotten, they just had decayed so much that they couldn't tell. So this was a tricky technology, but the good thing was they were able to locate inside the planks themselves still had the iron nails, right? Now there's been a lot of questions out there. Wait, 600 BC, were they smelting iron? The answer is absolutely yes. In fact, they were doing it for hundreds of years prior to this. And so we know that they had iron and they were able to do that. And without iron, you would struggle ever to be able to get these rudders to function. Now, if you can see down here, this is very heavy duty iron. When it was first built, they didn't use that. They just used ropes wrapped around to offset the bending moment that was applied to this rudder. Now you think about when this ship's moving at 5 knots, there is an amazing amount of counterforce resistance on this rudder. And here's what happens. Can you see that? That was the old rudder, and it just snapped right off like a toothpick when they got into some heavy seas with some heavy winds. And so Sudirman, who was our Indonesian ship boatswain, who's an amazing guy. Without him, I don't think this expedition could have been successful. He knew how to do everything with almost the most minimal of resources. This guy could come up with fixes to everything and anything, just using rope and baling rope and wood. Just incredible. So anyway, this was added later, and we had to reduce the size of the, I shouldn't say we, Philip Beale, because this was done before my leg of the trip, but they had to reduce the resistance force on these. And then it became really clear to Philip why they used 2 rudders. Because one rudder, there's too much resistance, but you can divide that resistance in half by using 2 smaller rudders and still have the adequate control that you need for this ship. Bottom line is, these guys were amazing with the degree of expertise that the Phoenicians had gained over the years. And these ships were being built for hundreds of years before 600 BC. So these were very mature, well-crafted ships that were being used in that time frame. So what we have is essentially 2 expeditions that I'm going to be able to talk about today. Both expeditions were conducted by the same ship, okay, the Phonecia, and that's obviously an image of the ship, and it is accurate down to the very finest details. Even the coloring of the sail has come through, because they are able to see on ancient Greek vases the paintings, and we know that they used the Phoenician purple on their sails. And so that's what we're looking at there. Okay, so the first expedition, I'm sorry, it's kind of a fuzzy image, but this is taken from one of their brochure, from Philip's old brochure. And his first expedition was an effort to, I think it's written right here. Yeah, to recreate the voyage referenced by Herodotus, who claimed that Pharaoh Necho hired the Phoenicians to circumnavigate the African continent in 600 BC, another key date, right? So, which is one of the reasons Philip was looking for a 600 BC vessel to begin with. He was a former Navy man and an explorer and adventurer, and so he was just set out to do this. He had done some similar things with Indonesian vessels a decade prior to this whole thing. And this all started in 2007, and then he began this voyage. Now I'm gonna overwrite. Let's see if this is gonna work. Yeah. So notice his departure. So he actually built the ship up here in off the coast of Syria and the island of Arwad, as I mentioned, and then it sailed down here and went through the Suez Canal. Okay, obviously that's a modern feature that wasn't there. At least we don't think it was there, a couple thousand years ago. And anyway, they sailed it down the Red Sea and came along here. Now, it was happening in 2008. A lot of you might remember about the Somali pirates. They were particularly problematic in 2008 time frame. And anybody who sailed around this cape right here, the Somali Cape, were subject to being raided by these pirates and getting kidnapped and held for ransom and so on. So Philip said, I'm not going to have any of that. And this ship in particular is going to be a prize, so we don't want it to get captured. So he sailed it. He would have just gone around here and headed down, but instead he sailed it to Salalah, Oman, which from a Book of Mormon point of view is pretty awesome, because that is Lehi's Bountiful. Within that region, we don't know the exact spot. There's obviously different theories, but it doesn't matter, because it's critical that he started in that region, and it's critical that he started in October of the year, and I'll talk about that. So we call this first voyage of 2008 to 10 circumnavigation by Beale, we call this Lehi's voyage. At least I do. And you'll see why here shortly. So they put in there and sailed it down. Now see the red line that I've got showing here? This is the actual path they followed. See the blue line, this light blue line? I don't know, are you able to see my mouse that I move it over the screen and stuff? Nod your head if you are. Okay, so I'm just moving my mouse. So this little blue line, this was their planned pathway. They were gonna stop at least one, if not maybe 4 times up the west coast of Africa on this circumnavigation, right? Because that's what they assumed that the ancient Phoenicians would have done. I mean, it's common to stop at intervals to get fresh food and water and so forth. And so it followed this path up to about this point. And then something really interesting happened. Whoops. So when they got to the Cape Horn down here, Cape Town, South Africa, they hit a major confluence of weather. I don't want to say a storm because it's a constant thing that's going on all the time. It's just that area. And when they got into those waters, the wind and the waves and the currents were just thrashing the ship. Okay, which brings to mind First Nephi chapter 19, when Nephi found himself being driven backward on the waters. They were in a great storm for 4 days and so on. Now it turns out Philip Beale had almost an identical experience, so much so that they had on board the ship, they had a GPS, so they knew where they were and they could track their progress. Well, he said that going around the Cape, and when they were in these conditions, which were really violent weather, the ship was being pushed forward at some of its fastest speed that it had ever gone, up 5, 6, 7 knots. Okay, which is pretty fast for this vessel. And yet the GPS, they could see literally they were going backwards. And that was because of the current. The current was pushing them faster than the wind could push them forward. And so they fought that for a number of days. Ultimately, their mainmast broke in the process, and they had to head in to shore, and they brought it in close, which is, you never want to do this. A little side note here, okay? I kind of smirk now when I hear archaeologists talking about, well, the way the ancients would have managed to get to, the New World is, they talk about the Solutrean. Maybe you've heard of the Solutrean theory, where in the skin boats and so forth, about 16 or 18,000 BP, that they came along in these small crafts and they hugged the shoreline as they went along, along Greenland and so forth and over to Canada. Well, let me just tell you, the last place you ever want to be in a boat, and I don't care if it's a skin boat or a Phoenician sailing vessel, a merchant craft like we were in, which is a 50-ton ship, okay? The last place you want to be is close to the shore. Why?
You crash.
What is under the water and you're close to the shore? Rocks. No sailor feels safe when he's close to the shore. That is the time a sailor takes flight, because when you're by the shore, you're in danger, and you don't know what's coming, and you can't stop. And so you don't want to be by the shore. So anybody who uses that argument to say that's how the ancients crossed over has never been on a ship. I might have thought that before this trip, but I'll tell you what, the most nervous you ever are is when you're close to shore. Out to sea, you feel safe and sound, no worries at all. All right, so anyway, this was the path they were on. They had to put in at Cape Town and make repairs, which they did. That's where they made the adjustments initially to their rudders and so on and so forth. So a lot of these kind of enhancements were done to the ship during this first expedition. All right. Now I put this slide in here, but it's really premature. So I'll just say it. No, this makes sense, because again, it's one ship, 2 expeditions. And so now let's talk about the second expedition. This is the one I was involved in, because this one actually started in 2019 in Carthage, Tunisia, sailing to Spain, Morocco, Canary Islands, and ultimately landing in the Dominican Republic. And which really completed the historic part of the voyage, okay, to be clear. And then after that, did more of a ceremonial landing in Fort Lauderdale and Miami, which I was part of. But anyway, that's the second expedition on the same ship, okay? Now imagine Thor Heyerdahl taking Raw 1 or Raw 2 and sailing it again, okay? It's not even possible. The thing was a wet sponge. It was barely above water. And this ship, it was already 10 years old before it took this voyage, and it had no problems. So yeah, this one was designed called Phoenicians Before Columbus, and to see if they could have reached the New World 2,000 years before Columbus. All right, now we're going to go through a little bit of discussion about travel and departures and so forth. We all are familiar with the text of the Book of Mormon, and I think there's pretty much general agreement that this was Lehi's path from Jerusalem. We know that he followed the borders of the Red Sea to a place called Nahum. Now there's been some archaeological evidence that indicate we might know where that is. And then if you go due east from there, it takes you right to Lehi's Bountiful, which is the Salalah, Kafur Kafat, that region. Is about a 50-mile stretch that even has the necessary elements. It's funny because I met some people from Salalah when I was in Tunisia, and they were just going on and on about what a beautiful place it is. And I said, do they have any bees there? Bees. Salalah honey is famous. It's one of the greatest places forever to get honey, and on and on. They went on to this thing. And I was like, well, that's interesting. So that's the path we know. Now, the question is, when did Lehi board the ship? And that's an important question to answer because it totally dictates the direction you go. Well, so what do we know? It says in First Nephi that after we had prepared fruit, meat, honey, and provisions, we would go down to the ship with our loading and our seeds and whatsoever thing we had brought according to his age, and we all got on the ship. Okay, so there's a big indication of the timing of when they did this. Now, after they got on, it says, after we gone down to the ship and taken our provisions, we did put forth in the sea and were driven before the wind, okay, toward the promised land. This is a ship, and all Phoenician ships have this design. It's called a shallow hull design. If any of you are sailors and you've been out on a sailing boat or a sailboat, that's not what most sailing craft have today. They have either a permanent or a deployable keel, okay? And the keel is a dagger board that goes down deep under the ship, and it serves a very good purpose, and that is to allow the ship to tack against the wind, okay? That means you can have a 45-degree wind coming at your side, and yet you can go at 90 degrees to that because of this keel that keeps you from skipping across the water. It keeps you moving, allows the wind to escape from your sail and push you forward rather than to the side. Well, now the Phoenicians did not have that. Either it was a technology they knew about and didn't use, or they had other reasons for not doing it, but they always sailed before the wind. So it was important to the Phoenicians. They set their broad sails directly so the wind was behind them at all times and it was pushing them. And that's why we learn about these voyages. They're annual types of things. You don't just go and come back. You have to wait for the wind to shift a year later or 6 months from the time you depart to come back, okay? Because winds do shift, trade winds shift. And that's what is the essence of this slide here. Prevailing trade winds, and we're looking at, here's Salalah. And from March to August, which would be the summer, the winds are northeasterly. And from September to February, they're southwesterly. Okay, that's just a constant switch, and they're very, the sailors lived and died by these because they knew it was constant. This doesn't change. This isn't subject to weather. These are trade winds. They're always constant. So it's important to know when Lehi left. So I would submit that since they gathered all their seeds and gathered all the honey, and they are at the 17 north latitude. Oh, sorry.
Boy, wouldn't these be monsoon winds rather than trade winds?
David, that is a very good comment. And I think they do attach the word monsoon to these. Thank you. I love it when people are, well, not always, but I like it when people are a lot smarter than I am, because they can make me look dumb or smart. So I'll say, yeah, oh yeah, I knew that all along, of course. But yeah, no, I've heard that monsoon actually attached to these. So I'll correct that on the slide, David. Good point. So these monsoon winds are constant, and they are, and depending on what time of day, year you leave, you're going to either go southeast, or you're going to go southwest, or you're going to go northeast. And so that's why I'm suggesting that Lehi left in the fall of the year. They are in the northern hemisphere. Salalah Oman is actually at the 17th latitude, and in the northern hemisphere. So their seasons are going to equate to those found in Jerusalem. And also all of the Jewish, like the feast of the first fruits and the feast of the tabernacles, they call that, and then the big harvest feast, I can't remember what that's called, all are attached to certain months of the year. And so they would have gone after the harvest feast, when they gathered all the seeds, all the fruit, everything else, which puts it in the fall of the year, in my view. And interestingly enough, well, this wasn't accidental or coincidental. Philip Beale knew that, and he knew he would have to leave in the fall to catch those winds in order to take this path southwest down around Africa. Now, you remember in my last picture, I showed you they were going to stop 4 times up the west coast. Well, in reality, that's not what happened. Okay. By the time they left Cape Town, they never saw land again. And for 100 and how many days? 123 days, I think, they didn't see any land. Now, the whole time, Philip told me we were fighting to go back. Our goal was not to go to America. Our goal was to, circumnavigate Africa in the shortest route possible. Well, this turns out to be the shortest route possible. You end up literally 3 days away from landfall in Cuba. And that's what happened on June 12th, 2010. And then you catch the another Atlantic current that does take you the opposite direction, and they were able to sail that back into Mediterranean. So this was the first voyage that was accomplished. I call it Lehi's voyage because Philip said it would have been easy to just not fight the ship, not fight the wind the whole way, and sail into the Gulf of Mexico. So that would have been an absolutely no-brainer. Yeah, David. You're on mute.
Thank you. I think you'll find that the trade winds blow basically along the Atlantic from east to west. Thus our hurricanes and those kind of things come along that southern area. And then about 40 degrees north or 40 degrees south, they're going from west to east. And so your map here, I think, is quite accurate, because the pushing of the trade winds would shove them over toward Cuba. But once they get far enough north of the equator, they'd be pushed back toward Europe again.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for that commentary. In fact, I even have shown here the 30-degree north latitude right there. So that kind of puts it in perspective. And so that's, so Philip said, if you were landing, doing this route, the most likely landing place would have been here. It could be anywhere in the Gulf, but one of the reasons, we like to say this region is because it is at the same latitude as Jerusalem, 30 degrees. And we know that when they planted their seeds, they brought forth abundantly. And so it makes sense that to plant in the same climate, at least in terms of the amount of sun and so forth. And the seasons would make sense why their crops did so well when they landed here. All right.
Boyd,
Yes.
I'm not sure whether you can
Frank.
see me or not. Thank
Yeah.
you. This also corresponds with the same kind of route that would have taken place by the Phoenicians who apparently landed in Brazil from about that same time period, 600 BC, with King Hiram. They left what is called the Paraíba stone down there, which has never been found since it's been transcribed. They made a rubbing of it and sent it to the Smithsonian, but people have looked for it. They've never found it yet. But it was written in Phoenician of that time period. And so that same route that you're talking about would have taken them, if they had been blown off course a little earlier, would have gone right straight into Brazil.
Absolutely. I first learned about that when I was reading Philip's first book, when he talks about that, and that is along the Brazilian coast. And I think the language that was written there in Phoenician says that we are stranded sailors. We were part of a 12 ship fleet, and
They've
may the
gone out of
gods,
sort of
gods,
Geber, yeah. And it was King Hiram was actually mentioned in that.
okay, yeah. So I think it's interesting, isn't it, and ironic how whenever these amazing, let's call them evidences, show up, they kind of just disappear somehow.
Yeah.
And or what else, or a variety of other problems come up we'll talk about in a second. Anyway, so that's thank you for that comment. And I'll try to remember how to go back to the screen here. Hopefully that's back where we were. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about Mulek and what we can surmise from the scriptures about him and studies that have done and so forth. This is some writings, some research done by Hugh Nibley regarding the name Mulek. It's not found in the Bible, but a student of Semitic languages will recognize it as a diminutive. That's a hard word. A term of affection and endearment, often meaning little king or prince. So it's like dear little king, right? So right there we get the sense that this is an infant king. He's not a grown adult, okay? And which is what led me to the conclusion that if he had been born, now people will argue this, and that's fine. I mean, nobody knows. But if he'd been born, I think that it would have been a matter of record. I mean, whenever the king has a son, that's a potential heir to the throne. And that's not just a minor, oh, by the way, I had a little son. No, that's a big deal. And it would have been, among the Jews, that would have been an important event. It would have been recorded. And when Nebuchadnezzar came and laid siege to Jerusalem, of course, then he would have known about this, or his entourage or his spies would have certainly found out. And the reason we can conclude that is because of what he did later. Right. So here is we gotta reshare my screen here. So the Babylonian Empire was growing in this time frame, 600 BC. It was growing massively, and they were conquering all of the major cities in the region. And I think I have the path here. Yeah, here's the path of destruction, if you will, or conquer. They came down, basically went through these cities. Sidon, of course, was one of the founding city of the Phoenician Empire, which is in Lebanon. And they continued down, conquering, taking over each of these sites as they came around And then they ultimately, button hooked back here, headed toward Jerusalem. And we have this quote from Isaiah prophecy suggesting that the walls of Jerusalem would be filled in by the very bricks of their homes. And so there's an indication that this part of the wall was actually discovered in 1969, and they call it the Broad Wall, was built in that time frame. And it's indicative of the fact that they were desperate to try to defend themselves, but ultimately not successful. So the question comes up then, at least it's a logical one, how did Mulek escape? And one thing that we know is that he was a son of the king of Zedekiah, who was the king of Judah in 589. And he, that is Zedekiah, after he saw that the city was going to fall, and we could go into that whole history. Maybe a lot of you already know about the treaties that they had made with Nebuchadnezzar, and then the Jews had broken those treaties repeatedly. And Nebuchadnezzar was very, very unhappy on this last time, and he determined that he was not going to let him get away with any more of this. So after 3 months, this city fell. Zedekiah and his family tried to escape. As they were doing so, they were captured at a place called Riblah. And it's a sad tale of Zedekiah being forced to witness the assassination of his sons, who were all potential heirs to the kingdom, to the throne. And so after they were killed, his eyes were put out and he was dragged to Babylon, where he was kept literally on display as a witness to the fact that he had seen the end of his kingdom. There were no heirs. And he knew there were no heirs, right? At least publicly, and certainly that's what he was able to bear witness to if anybody asked. So nobody could claim the throne. And with these kings, that was their biggest threat, or the biggest challenge, is that somebody would show up and say, I'm a rightful heir to the throne. So that's why I contend that the existence of Mulek had to be virtually unknown. And the only way that could be absolute is if he hadn't been born yet, right? I believe that Zedekiah, I think it's established that he had multiple wives. And so one of those wives was no doubt, his mother, and she was inspired, directed, guided by the Lord. Now, I've often wondered, maybe you have too, why was it so important, why does it matter that there's a seed of the royal lineage be preserved? Why wasn't it okay just to take Lehi and Nephi, and they were sons of Joseph, they were part of that same lineage in effect, and so why were they not adequate? Why was it so important for the Lord to preserve a seed of Zedekiah? Does anybody have a thought on that? Just curious. Frank, go ahead.
Unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, I believe that it was necessary to fulfill the prophecies about the kingdom of Judah. There were two sons born to Judah, Zerah and Pharez. And the Pharez line was this one. And then there was the Zerah line, which was part of of another escape to the far west, really. And there had to be a survivor to fulfill the prophecies of the Bible that talk about the throne lasting until the Messiah comes. And Zedekiah couldn't be the very last one.
No.
And his son, he had a son that could carry on a kingdom later on in the New World.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, you probably someone can quote the scripture, but I believe it goes back to Genesis when Jacob was giving the blessings to his sons. And you remember he gave a blessing to Judah that the scepter shall never depart from thee. And Joseph also received a blessing that he would have the birthright. Now, that translates to, from things I've studied, that the kingdom, the kingly descendancy would go through Judah's line. And that would, like you just said, Frank, it would continue forever. What did I just say? The scepter shall never depart from thee. And so the Lord is faithful to always fulfill his promises. And that, I believe, is the reason he didn't just say, oh, well, I've got Lehi, he'll count. No, he was absolutely, literally faithful. And he kept the seed of Zedekiah and brought him from the old Jerusalem and brought him to the new Jerusalem. As David.
Perhaps the alternate side of that, King David was not of the lineage of the king. Therefore, God can raise up a king of any lineage he wished.
So you just blew my entire theory? You just blew my entire theory, David? Is that what you're saying? Frank, we'll get
there's also there's also a prophecy about the throne of David that would last in the same way. So, the prophecies continue. Like Abraham was given the prophecy that he would have a multitude of nations come from him, as was Sarah, and then Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. All of them had the same kind of thing. And so it doesn't have to go through one exact one, but it's always there.
Yeah, no. So there we go. It's never quite as just clean as we always want it to be, or perfect, right? But I'll bet you Frank's point and David's point are both correct, because the Lord does keep his promises, A, and finds ways to get it done, B. So this is kind of where we are right now. Let's see. Boom. Boom. Okay. So what then happens? So we read, there's very little. The Book of Mormon is very stingy with details about the Mulekites. That's just a fact. But there are enough in there that it's amazing how much we can draw from it. And anyway, in Omni, we read that they journeyed in the wilderness. Okay, now the wilderness is not just a random word to anybody who's familiar with Hebrew writing. And it goes on to say they were brought by the hand of the Lord across the great waters into the land where Mosiah discovered them, and they dwelt there from that time forth. Now, my co-author, David Doan, is the one who's really an expert on this. So I'm just going to kind of throw his slide in here and let him talk to it. But he maintains, and I think there's good support for this, that the wilderness is the Sinai Peninsula area. That is true wilderness. Why? Because nobody lives there, and there's very little water, and it's very hard to stay alive. So it is literally a wilderness. And we have these quotes in 2 Kings and Jeremiah. Zedekiah's women headed for Egypt to escape the Chaldeans, which is the reference, possible reference to this escape, right? From Zedekiah's people, they headed south, into Egypt, which is indeed the wilderness. And Mulek, we learned from Omni, journeyed in the wilderness. So those two kind of come together there. Now, it's possible they would have come down here, gone through the wilderness, made their way maybe to the Nile, and then down the Nile into Memphis, where there would be ships plenty to take west. David does some further research, which I think is quite interesting here, actually, and says that it may, in fact, well have been that they didn't just go across this upper section of the wilderness, but traveled all the way down to the Red Sea. The Phoenicians actually had a major port there at Aqaba. And from there, you could sail to a place here on the Egyptian coast. And then they had, and this is where I'm not quite sure, but they had routes, trade routes across from there to Elephantine. And Elephantine was a major establishment of the Jews. They even had a temple there, a very elaborate, fully developed temple, much like the Temple of Solomon. From here, they could go down the Nile and make that same exit to the west. And so all of this, the details of it are going to be in the book that's forthcoming. And it's amazing. He's taken me through this, and it's just phenomenal amount of research and material that he's got there. In fact, I'll just kind of show you this. These are just some of the content here that I'm not going to read through or pretend to know a lot about, but it's now captured in the slideshow. So if anybody wants to stop and read that, they can. David will suggest, and there's remarkably good evidence to support, that they didn't just sail out the Mediterranean and across the sea the way I went, okay? It's very possible and likely that they headed north to Great Britain. And many of you may be familiar with the writings of the Celtic writings about Jeremiah being in, the green lands of Ireland. And in fact, there is a lot of history about, the royal lineage being there, which is where we get the modern day monarchy for England and Great Britain. I'm seeing some thumbs ups out there, and probably you guys know a lot more about this than I do, but that's also going to be included in the book. David's done phenomenal research in this area. It will be fascinating to explore this. And from there, now if you sail from Great Britain, it puts you on a different path. It's a different trade route than so we have these two possibilities here, okay? If you look here, this is the trip I took, the dotted line that goes south here through the Canary Islands, which is essentially the same route that Columbus used. And then it actually sloped a lot further south than his line shows here, but then it circles up and comes into the Gulf of Mexico. That's one path. And then in our Heartland model, we have them going up the Mississippi to Zarahemla. Okay, and Zarahemla, we suggest, is where we read about a place called Zarahemla in the Lord's Commandments when he gave them to Joseph Smith. Section 125, verse 3 of the Doctrine and Covenants says, opposite the city of Nauvoo, thou shalt construct a city, and the name upon the city, let the name upon the city be Zarahemla, named upon it. And that's kind of got us thinking, well, wait a minute, is that possible to put Zarahemla in Iowa? And the answer is, doggone, it really does work, because it was on the west side of the River Sidon, at a place where the river could be crossed on foot. And lo and behold, Nauvoo was the first place, possibly the second place in the entire length of the Mississippi River where it can be crossed on foot, right? Up until 1848, when they put in the Keokuk Dam. After that, you could no longer cross on foot. But Commerce, the reason that little town of Commerce that became Nauvoo was called Commerce, because it was the place where they would transport, they would portage, every ship would stop there, and they would transport goods 5 miles upstream above the Des Moines Rapids, where the average depth of the water over the rapids is 18 inches, and not enough to sail any kind of a riverboat up. And so they would transport it up 5 miles and then reload, and then they could go another 500 miles from there, clear up into Minnesota. So that's the one path. And then the other alternate path that David Doan is suggesting, and he's going to make a case for this, and so I'm certainly open to it, is that they sailed from Great Britain and followed this line here and came into the St. Lawrence Seaway, ultimately making their way to the Great Lakes and then coming down to Zarahemla that way. That has a lot of going for it, and this has going for it. So until we know more, we don't know more. But those are two possible routes that have a case that can be built for them. for the path that Mulek would have used. The text here is interesting. It says they had the people came out from Jerusalem. They were brought by the hand of the Lord across the great waters into the land where Mosiah discovered them, and they dwelt there from that time forth. So we know that where they finally landed it became Zarahemla, because that's where they discovered them, and that's where they never moved from. Okay, now, so the next question is, well, wait a minute. Is there any like evidence for Phoenicians in North America? And so the answer is yes. And it comes to us in the form of artifacts from a cave called the Burroughs Cave. Highly controversial, of course, just like the Paraiba stone that disappeared in Brazil. But these stones haven't disappeared. They're available now. They can be looked at. They can be examined. John White, who passed away just a few years ago, actually allowed David to photograph all of these actual artifacts that he had. And, you know, to this day, you can see the author of the book, or the title of the book, Burroughs Cave, Fraud or Find of the Century. All right. So it's not surprising to me. Again, I'm in the minority position here, aren't I? It's not surprising to me that scholars and archaeologists declare, well, this is obviously a fraud, right? Because it doesn't make sense that Phoenician writing would show up on a stone in North America. Okay. Well, that's true unless Mulek came over on a Phoenician ship, and then it makes total sense. So a lot of times these things are dismissed because of a preconceived assumption. The assumption is, well, everybody knows there were no Jews, no Hebrews in America, you know, before Columbus. Therefore, anything that shows up obviously is fraud. Well, that's true if that were true, but we actually believe that there was people who came over from, we believe the Book of Mormon. And so if it's true, this totally makes sense. So a lot of things need to be viewed in their proper context. These are more stones that are taken from that collection, clearly Egyptian, clearly, you know, this is not your typical American Indian kind of headdress going on here. This one is obviously distinctive in the sense that it looks like a Phoenician ship. Now, critics have said, well, you can't have the rudders coming out of the front. And that's true, you can't. And so I'm not quite sure, you know, what's going on there. But again, it could be the amateur nature of the person, the copier who created this thing. He probably wasn't a sailor. He was probably an artist, right? And so he was doing what he thought he saw or was being depicted to him. But to me, just having those, what look like oars, or arguably they could be rudders, you would never have them on the front of the ship. They wouldn't last 5 minutes, okay? So I think that's just an artistic creation. It's not anything that would say, therefore it's a fraud. I don't think that's the best conclusion to reach. Here's another example. Now this is a warship, right? When you see that battering ram on the front of this, that is actually a warship, and that's surprising. It would be more likely to imagine that you'd have cargo ships and merchant ships over here, but have a warship. But in a minute, if I have time, I might talk a little bit about the function of warships in the Phoenician world.
We may need to invite you back, Boyd, because
Are we out of time?
hour is up, and I'm not sure how much time that Robert can put on his tape, but we do commonly allow for another half hour of questions or so. So,
you know, I'm happy to start just stop and take questions, maybe do another part of it, because I really haven't even gotten into the trip yet, the voyage yet. So
there's questions that need to be asked here.
Yeah.
You mentioned the purple on the sail, and that purple shows up again in the Shoal Maya in the southern Gulf Coast. Very curious that your ship turns north, you turn it south, that it picks up a strong parallel just on that beautiful purple paint purple color, which comes from a very small snail. And I think Vernilo Simmons did research that shows up in her book on that matter.